Hello, welcome everybody. Please continue to eat while I'm talking, but welcome to the American Philosophical Society. I'm Kimberly Guinta, I'm the director of the APS Press, and I'm your host this afternoon. Okay, we begin our meetings with a land acknowledgement. So without further ado, we would like to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenapehoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people, whose ancestral relationships and connections with this land continue to this day and into the future. On behalf of the APS, I wish to express sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals throughout this continent who have offered guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration in the present and throughout the Society's history. Moving on, for those of you who may be visiting us for the first time, here's a little bit about the APS. The American Philosophical Society is the oldest learned society in the United States. It was founded in 1743 by Ben Franklin for the purpose of promoting useful knowledge. In the 21st century, we sustain this mission in three principal ways. We honor and engage leading scholars, scientists, and professionals through elected membership and opportunities for interdisciplinary intellectual fellowship, particularly in our semi-annual meetings. We support research and discovery through grants and fellowships, lectures, publications, prizes, exhibitions, and public education. We serve scholars through a research library of manuscripts and other collections, which I think is on the next slide, internationally recognized for their enduring historic value. The American Philosophical Society's current activities reflect Franklin's spirit of inquiry, provide a forum for the free exchange of ideas, and convey our conviction that intellectual inquiry and critical thought are inherently in the best interests of the public. Our speaker today is Dr. Fenella Heckscher. Fenella has a long interest in natural history, from her country childhood in England to gardening now in the Hudson Valley. She studied zoology at Oxford University and then turned to medicine, graduating from Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York, and subsequently working there as a pediatric endocrinologist. Fenella and her husband retired to Orange County, New York, where she learned about the existence of Jane Colden and her Botanic Manuscript through her local garden club's lore. Jane had lived close to where Fenella retired. Fenella then felt compelled to return to London to study the details of the original document. Jane's description of early American flora fascinated Fenella, who had also started being amazed again by plants, and she started to wonder how Jane Colden achieved these scientific contributions to the American botanical enlightenment, which led to this book, Jane Colden's Botanic Manuscript, The Legacy of America's First Woman Botanist, which is a meditation on the plants that Jane wrote about and their relation to the plants we still see today, as well as a beautifully told biography of Jane Colden. It is available for purchase at the back of the room, and you're welcome to flip through it and see all the beautiful photographs and drawings that were Jane's original illustrations. Please join me in welcoming Fenella Heckscher.
Thank you, Kim. Can everyone hear? Okay, thank you. So my deepest gratitude and thanks to Kimberly and all of the APS staff. They've been good shepherds with much skill and patience for a first-time author to get this book to publication. I'm very grateful to them. And the title, Jane Colden's Botanic Manuscript, The Legacy of America's First Woman Botanist, would make you think she's pretty well known. But you ask both botanical people, garden club people, historians, who is America's first woman botanist? And usually there's a pretty blank look. And it's time, overdue, to try to bring her into a little bit of botanical sunshine. So thank you for this chance to give Jane a view of the world. But first, a little bit of history that relates very much to the American Philosophical Society. In 1744, Dr. Cadwallader Colden, Jane's father, in New York province, wrote to a colleague in London, "A philosophical society is now forming at Philadelphia. They have done me the honor to take me into their society." However, unfortunately, he never attended a meeting. However, he had a very long correspondence with, in America and in Europe, and signed his name many times, hence his signature is here. Jane is here to represent him today. Since he never attended a meeting, I think I could offer that. And most of her writing was her Botanical Manuscript, which had no title in her time and was unsigned. And hunting through the very few letters that are available, this one that she did write later on in 1756 to a botanist at Edinburgh University, known to her father, was the only signature that I've been able to get for her. So she's here in signature, but there's no portrait to show you. We have to show you what she wrote and her plants. So starting off here with her parents, since there's no portrait of her, we start with them. Dr. Cadwallader Colden was a Scottish physician who emigrated to Philadelphia in 1710 and gradually worked his way through to New York to become Surveyor General of the province of New York, the head of the King's Council, hence his portrait, rather formal, and ultimately Lieutenant Governor of the province of New York, as things were, to some people's views, unfortunately, heading towards revolution. Enough of that topic for today. His wife, Alice Christa Colson, also came from parents who were in the Scottish church. They were both educated Scots, bore 10 children, of whom 8 she brought up in childhood. And Jane was their 5th child, and Jane and her youngest brother David shared their father's intellectual interests. Jane, as I've said, is largely unknown, but this was the first mention of her name. It may not be very apparent in this letter from 1725, but it's a letter from a Scottish uncle ending in greetings to the Colden children, to Sandy, Betty, her older sister, Jeannie, which was a Scottish form of Jane, and Cad Jr. And on the other side is the way correspondence happened in those days, a large sheet of paper written with the message on one side, and on the other side addressed to Cadwallader Colden, Doctor of Medicine, New York. Attention, the Sun Coffee House. And a letter came, carried by hand, to the Sun Coffee House and eventually got picked up and eventually got to Dr. Colden. And that was how correspondence was carried out throughout his time, getting a little more efficient, but not much. And that's how part of the story was told. We have Jane's writing, which is in a manuscript form in the Natural History Museum in London. That's another story. And Dr. Cadwallader Colden's correspondence saved at the New York Historical Society in New York, largely because of his political career. But in there are snippets about his continuing botanical interests from his time as a student at the University of Edinburgh in the Physic Garden and his long-time scientific interests. So that's the quick background on the family. And here's where they are in the Hudson Valley. This map on the left shows from the entry into the Hudson River down at Manhattan, heading upwards towards Albany, with Newburgh in the middle, circled by blue, and Coldenham, Colden's farm on the Hudson River, which is where Jane grew up. And on the right, in the square circle, shows the Colden acres, and it looks like this land is well populated. These are both later maps. And at the time when he was founding his farm, it was very much frontier territory. And so Jane's farm childhood was in frontier forested territory of that time, in between the Hudson River on the bottom, where Newburgh was founded in 1709, and then up at the top you can see, I think there's the Wallkill River with swampy land, so she's between the Hudson Highlands and swampy land of the Wallkill River. We don't know the house where she grew up, but these are two examples of houses by apparently the same builder, William Bull. On the left is William Bull's own house, 1722, and onwards, built for his own family. And on the right is the last house by William Bull for the Ellison family, which is now Knox's headquarters and a state historic site, and looks rather like a state historic site, but I'd like you to look more at the old farmhouse, small rooms, little light, where Jane presumably had a table by a window to sit down and do her writing amid a very busy household. How she did it is unclear. And the landscape she was in starts off with the Hudson River, which was the main thoroughfare between Manhattan and Albany. And here is a view looking north from West Point, where the river is clearly the main thoroughfare with all the boats on it. It's a century later than the Coldens were there. There's some clearing, but you can see the kind of rough territory. And another view of the territory, again from a Hudson River School of Painters, of a farmhouse in the Catskills, edge of the Catskills by Gifford. And one of the things it shows are the many stumps of trees, and Gifford was somewhat criticized for his always painting stumps of trees. But this was the clearance of a frontier farm and very much where Jane grew up. And for this, I have to also pause, as Kim did, to acknowledge this is the land of the Munsee group of the Lenape indigenous people, from which the invaders, if you like, were gradually taking over territory. So we've got the landscape, and now what is the curiosity about American plants and a botanical network that formed with Cadwallader Colden being the correspondents going to and fro and forming a network of people who would support his great interest. And within all of that, you have to hear his interest, but underneath and close by in the house is his daughter Jane listening to all of this. The first person to be listed is Peter Collinson, a London Quaker merchant who requested American seeds and plants for English gardens, and he was in touch with a colleague, John Bartram, who I hardly have to explain in this place, a Philadelphia Quaker farmer and great plant explorer, and he and Peter Collinson had a long-time correspondence. And in turn, they corresponded and linked in with Johann Friedrich Gronovius, a Dutch scholar and botanist in Leiden, and a very early supporter of Carl Linnaeus, the great Swedish botanist, who created a new order to botany with systems of classification and plant names. And in the middle of all of this are the Coldens and the new American flora. Peter Collinson, I'll explain briefly because he's important, and under this very somber appearance, he's a passionate gardener and a widespread correspondent and a great friend. he connected with many people, but chiefly two quotes from him. In one of his earliest letters to Dr. Colden, he says, P.S. If an ingenious man and a great teacher under nature named John Bartram of Pennsylvania should wait on you, please give him what information you need. He has been a considerable traveler in your world to collect seeds. And a year later, Peter Collinson is commenting to Dr. Colden, pray have you thought that most of your vegetables, in other words, plants, are different from ours? This curiosity from Europe for the American plants that were unknown. And a further piece of chance was a book. Dr. Colden managed to see an early copy of Genera Plantarum by Carl Linnaeus, which was shown to him by a Dutch medical student, a Dutch New Yorker medical student who'd gone to study in Leiden. And Dr. Colden reports, this gave me the perusal of Dr. Linnaeus's characters or descriptions of plants that excited my curiosity to examine the plants which grew around my house. And so he started from this new system to describe the plants around his house, and I imagine followed closely by his daughter. And he wrote Plantae Coldenhamii, which was published by Linnaeus somewhat later on, with, again, great enthusiasm about the plants, but a misspelling of Dr. Colden's name. Who cares? It was about the plants. I'll already go back on one, but here, no, go on. And progressing onwards, what started Jane on her botanic quest? In 1742, a letter written during the winter, when you imagine the household was close together near the fire, and Jane was probably at her father's elbow. A letter from Dr. Colden to Peter Collinson. Few in America have any taste of botany. We have nothing in botany tolerably done in English. More useful in America where the learned languages are little understood. And then this key sentence. The ladies are at least well fitted for this study as the men by their natural curiosity and the accuracy and quickness of their sensations. Something to think about. And a number of years later, 1755, Dr. Colden writing to Gronovius, I have a daughter who has an inclination to reading and a curiosity for natural philosophy or natural history. She has now grown very fond of the study. She has already a pretty large volume in writing of the descriptions of plants. So this is where it was starting. On the left here is one example of her writing, and I did not try to reproduce all her writing in the book. It's too difficult. Some of it's quite faded. But what it does is describe from the entry heading through the details of Linnaeus's characters or descriptions with a lot of detail about the flowers, which was his focus, and on through the rest of the plant. And then she also did illustrations, outlines, or sketches of the leaves. And so there are bits throughout the book of showing her writing. It is now just become digitally available, should you be interested, from the Natural History Museum in London. But there will be examples throughout the book quoting it. And to add just a little bit, she didn't do flowers, largely, just little outlines occasionally. And here we have some color photographs to give some pops of color, and her favorite color that appeared to be purple. This plant, she headed Ceratula or Sawwort, and I had to do some detective work to find out that this indeed was now known as New York ironweed or Vernonia novieborensis. So that is just a quick look at the manuscript, and now to take a dive into it, just looking first at the landscape that she found a path through, the untouched forest of the Northeast. And this again is another picture from the Hudson River School of Romantic Scenery. They thought it was romantic a century after Jane Colden trod on, I think you'll agree, very rough territory for a lady in a long skirt and heaven knows what footwear. And I've chosen to represent her manuscript in a sort of journal, a walkthrough, starting with the trees and then going monthly. First of all, through the 13 trees that she described, with one example of the beech tree and her drawing of the leaves. It was not following a sketch. She sketched it herself. And the heading of the beech tree, which I hope you can see at the top there, that has separate male and female flowers on the same tree. The Linnaean system focused very much on the sexual aspect of the plants, and many Europeans was horrified by this. Dr. Colden taught his farm-raised daughter, no problem. Some tree flowers, some beautiful, some tiny. These are a couple of beautiful ones of the tulip poplar and the wild cherry. Others were much smaller, for which she needed a magnifying glass, presumably carried in her pocket. And my wonder here was, how did she reach these flowers to find the details? I don't know. So starting in March with her entry, number 271 out of 341 entries, this one she didn't give a name. She just had the early flowering shrub, which turns out to be the downy shadbush. And after her long, page-long writing on the details, she added her note, "They flower in March, early in the spring, before the leaves are out. The tree is white with flowers and is very remarkable at that time." So she did her detailed descriptions and then often added her own little note. By April, she remarks on these flowers being ephemeral. On the left is the dwarf ginseng, and on the right, the well-known trout lily. For the ginseng, she said, "The whole plant, that is the stalk and leaves, decay as soon as the seed is ripe, which is about the end of May and appears no more until the next spring." Many of the plant descriptions, of which there were not that many at this time from America, were more lists of plants or in Latin. She is giving her detailed description, but she's adding the fact that she's watching about this plant throughout its entire season, a little bit unusual. And on the right, she does the same for the trout lily. By May, there's a great increase in the number of flowers and forms, and on the left, she is describing Doronicum, or poor robin's breath, European terms for this flower, now known as a fleabane, one of the Erigeron group. And it's one of the compositae group of plants, and she describes in there, again, I'm not sure if you can see, if I get, no, go back. Don't know if it'll go back. Got it. Okay. That she describes the flowers in the disc, in the middle, and in the rays. So she's describing details which many people would not know about. And then she also describes another form of flowers, the lupin, with likewise quite complicated structure. By June, and summer solstice approaching, she terms these two kinds of grass, a very common term used then for plants, the blue-eyed grass and the yellow star grass. And further plants in June bring in something else. She described the ground leaves as blood-red veins, a warning of rattlesnakes. She's out there exploring, and rattlesnakes are certainly part of the territory, and sought after, on the right, as herbal remedies for snakebite, is the Seneca snake root. And here she adds at the bottom, observat. Linnaeus describes this as being a papillomatous flower. I must beg leave to differ from him. Here is somebody challenging the great Linnaeus, a woman from America. I don't think she thought of that, but interesting. By July, you've got more herbal remedies. Again, she describes the plants in great detail, but then comes to NB. The root of this Asclepias, taken in a powder, is an excellent cure for the colic. And on the right, she observes the country people here make a tea of the leaves. They reckon it's a great purifier of the blood. So she is talking also to others. She talks about contact with the Indians, and she talks about the country people who appear to be local small-time farmers, some of whom who worked for her father. She herself was not a herbalist. She didn't prescribe these things, but she described the uses of the plants. And by July, we're getting into the wetlands around Colden, lots of them. And on the left, two examples of bog-loving plants with the common arrowroot. She comments, the male and female flowers grow upon different plants. They grow in water. I leave it to you to imagine, how did she get into the water to know this? And on the right, we've got, oh, wait a minute, that's the next one. Okay, that was the wetlands. For August, we see goldenrod's orphan as just one mass of color, but for her, it was 10 different species. She could identify the different species. With the first one, we now know as Solidago canadensis, or Canada goldenrod, but she could identify the many tiny florets set very close and making up one big flower head. By September, she's identifying of how that leaf looks. She had no training in art, in drawing at all. Supplies were very limited, but she managed to do some very close replications of them. And there were many other species of asters, with her favorite purple, and then a blue wood aster and the calico aster. By October, the last flowers. Again, a detailed description, and then at the end, she observes the whole plant through its life cycle. What is remarkable in this shrub is that it flowers in the fall or autumn after the leaves have fallen, and the seeds of the former year are ripe at the time it begins to flower. She is observing it all. She also includes weeds and herbs. I started off looking at this work of hers thinking, here are all the native plants, terrific. Well, there's some weeds and herbs in there. Some, she says, grew in cleared fields. The seed was brought in hay from England. She could identify where it came from. Others were brought for beneficial use as vegetables and herbs, and she started, I think, her botanical life in the vegetable garden with her father instructing him, as he had been in turn in the Edinburgh Physic Garden, of showing her. So here are the leaf drawings, larger from the herb garden. And finally, she ends up with the dock, the rumex on the left. The root of this plant is esteemed as an excellent antiscorbid against scurvy. It cures bad corrosive ulcers in the mouth. So some are herbs to her and weeds to us today. And just trying to put this all together, Dr. Colden had started her off on this, but here he is saying, I was exceedingly pleased that my daughter Jane took an inclination to botany. She is more curious and accurate than I could have been. So by 1757, he's saying these are Jane's words. She is writing it. And a quick summary of the Botanic Manuscript as seen today. Her detailed description allowed 328 species to be known with current names to the best of my not very specialized ability with some help. She called some of them anonymous, like this example here, which we now know as Heckscher americana, or alum root, but it showed she had an open mind. She wasn't trying to force it in. She was a scientist and a botanist. And it's a work in progress. It was not finished, but it's remarkable botanical science for her time and place. This is not the end. We have to explain what botanical resources are available for her. How did she do this? And in 1679, John Bannister, one of the earlier explorers, wrote from Virginia to his Oxford professor, Robert Morrison, "I've met with a great number of trees, shrubs, and herbs, that I know not what to make of them for want of books." And here is a picture of an early woodcut from a herbal of the common milkweed. And on the right is an engraving from Morrison's herbaria of 1699, which he just entitled Chrysanth Americanum. So not very helpful names and not very helpful information, and none of those books, in fact, were available to Jane. Mark Catesby is probably better known to you, with some wonderful drawings, both of the flora and the fauna, with a tulip tree and a Baltimore eagle, and then on the right, a Carolina lark and the little yellow starflower. But these wonderful books were published in England and were not available here, except a very small copy available, given to John Bartram. And Dr. Colden never mentioned Catesby, so we think these were not available. Going on to Carl Linnaeus and his role in this, he created order out of some degree of botanical chaos, because all the earlier describers were describing plants in lengthy paragraphs and different words. And in 1737, he published Genera Plantarum, describing a simple plant classification based on the accounts of the stamens, the male organs, shown in this picture. No, wrong. It's back again. And on the pistils, the female organs. So this was, on the right is George Ehret's diagram from 1736 of the sexual system of plant classification of Linnaeus that Cadwallader Colden happily taught his daughter. And this, to me, looking at it in the Linnaean Society in London, a wonderful place to visit if you ever get a chance, an eye-opener for American botany. When I opened Genera Plantarum, here inside was neatly folded in the Ehret diagram. And so when Dr. Colden saw Genera Plantarum, this for him was a sight of Ehret's diagram. And I looked at this first, at the first edition, and it didn't quite match up with some things Jane had put in there. And then I found in the second edition that this matched. So here on the left is her description of an early description of a violet, and next to it, press the right button, she's got Viola 821. And I've got here from Linnaeus's book, the second edition from 1742, he had Viola, and it's also got the 821, the same number. So it turns out that this is probably the book that Jane had. And then the next query was, she comments on Granovius, and where did she get this from? Here's a comment: "I cannot conceive why Granovius should make this shrub," the plant on the right of the grey dogwood, "should make this shrub the same genus with the Cornus florida, as it differs greatly from it." Again, she's being quite provocative in her comments. And how did this come about? So the two books that we're pretty sure she had were, first of all, the Flora Virginica, which Dr. Granovius sent to Dr. Colden from Leiden. It took 2 years, but it eventually got to him. And you've got here, in his description of Granovius's description, based on John Clayton's descriptions from Virginia, the two kinds of dogwood that Jane Colden is describing. So it's pretty clear she had, I jumped ahead here. Okay, two books, the Flora Virginica and the Genus Plantarum, and I think that was just all her resources. Now, she also had visitors to Coldenham. And the first visitor to Coldenham to visit Dr. Colden was John Bartram. And he came twice to collect plants in the nearby Catskill Mountains. And one thing she saw was John Bartram exploring, as he reported in his journal from a site here in Philadelphia. Jane observed his report. Next morning, as soon as I could see, we hunted plants until after breakfast. After dinner, we went to Ye River to gather arborvitae seeds, as on the right. So she observed this great plant explorer exploring. She may have picked up something from that. Much later on, she corresponded herself with John Bartram. We don't have that letter to find her signature, but he replied, "Respected friend Jane Colden, I received thine of October 26, 1756, and read it several times with agreeable satisfaction. It keeps company with ye choicest correspondence, ye European letters." Thank you, John Bartram. Another visitor to Coldenham, Dr. Alexander Garden, another Scottish physician, much younger, more terms with Jane, who now was living in Charlestown, South Carolina, and he visited also to Coldenham. Dr. Colden was very well known and regarded, and he wrote to one of his professors in Edinburgh. In the summer of 1754, about a mile from the town of New York, found a plant. At first took it to be a hypericum, St. John's wort, but on examining, found it to be different. Sent the characteristics to Miss Jenny Colden, a very ingenious young lady and curious botanist. She replied with her earlier entry from 1753, and her description forms the basis for the publication by Dr. Garden in Edinburgh in 1756. This was one of the few things that got published. And then comes up the question of naming of a plant. Jane understood the privilege of the first describer, that she could name the plant, and she called this one in her manuscript Gardenia, which may be a little puzzling to us today. However, Linnaeus denied this, and in fact it took a long battle with Linnaeus for a plant to be named for Gardenia years later, which got named for a Cape jasmine miles away from where he grew up. Jane made the case here that this plant had the number of chives not only make this a different genus, but would make an order which Linnaeus has not. However, this one stuck for a long time with being called Hypericum virginicum. One more attempt at a naming. In 1757, Dr. Colden writes to Dr. Fothergill, another Quaker physician in London, "I send you the description and figure of a plant done by my daughter Jenny, which I think has not been before described, and likewise makes a new genus." John Ennis, a close colleague, a naturalist in London, who did a lot of writing to Linnaeus, said, "This young lady merits your esteem. Her father has a plant called after him, Coldenia. Suppose you should call this Coldenella. That might distinguish her among your many genera." This was not to be. And in 1808, the name was changed from Helleborus triforum, never to be Jane Colden's name, and in 1808 it got renamed Coptis trifolia, which is what it's known with today. In 1758, there were great changes, 1760 for the Colden family. And the French and Indian Wars were coming close to the farm, and this is a picture of one of her last entries, which was very brief, and Alexander Colden, as the eldest son, was persuading his father to move, and by 1758, Dr. Colden moved to a house in Flushing Bay. And Jane and her other sister moved with him, the family, and in 1759, she married a Scottish widower physician in New York. And sadly, the next year, she died. I won't dwell on that because I need to move forwards quickly. After her death, interestingly enough, in Dr. Colden's correspondence, there was no mention either of Jane, and her Botanic Manuscript was left to its own fate. By 1760, Dr. Colden was appointed lieutenant governor of the province, often acting as a governor. Here, in this picture, he is seen as a senior statesman, but also not often mentioned in the books on his political career. He was a family man and continued to be a scientist. In 1776, he died as British troops surrounded New York at the beginning of the Revolution. Jane's plants, however, live on to tell the rest of the story, which I may have to do fairly quickly. Her plants became newly described by later botanical authors. So as they were described by new people, they had their name attached afterwards, not her name, their name. And this is a quick list of people who had that designation, starting with some famous in Philadelphia, Humphrey Marshall, who in 1789 wrote his American Grove about trees dedicated to the American Philosophical Society. Further down the list is the great Benjamin Smith Barton, who tutored many of these other people. And the examples on the right show the rhododendron pericarpinoides, or pinkster flower, which has one of the Michaud's name attached to it. And on the right is the great purple fringed orchid that has Jacob Bigelow's name attached to it. So her plants lived on, and in 1843 there is a mention that she hadn't completely been forgotten, but Professor Asa Gray, by then the Harvard professor of natural sciences, asked a Colden grandson if he could look at Dr. Colden's correspondence, and noted that Jane Colden was the first botanist of her sex in this country, and said she has very correctly described under the name of Gardenia the Hypericum virginicum of Linnaeus, and skillfully indicated the characters which generically distinguish it from Hypericum. High praise from the Harvard professor. However, she was not there to hear it. One extra little bit added by Gray in 1848 in his Manual of Botany of the Northern United States, in the introduction, he explained that a change in plant classification had taken place, that the Linnaean system had served for over 1 century to allow the description of all the American botany in a way that was simple and could be used by people without libraries, without herbaria. They just needed to be able to count the number of stamens. And that's what Jane used, and it spread probably through her father, through Alexander Colden, and so on. But Asa Gray was explaining the change to a natural system using multiple plant characters that needed learned people. And so what happened to the Botanic Manuscript? It traveled. And here we catch up with it, luckily, within the currently bound Botanical Manuscript in London, are some notes that explain a little bit. In 1782, a note signed by Frederick von Wangenheim, a forester turned into a Hessian mercenary, who served in New York. And unfortunately, his note with the date and the signature are too faint to show, but it showed he was in New York at that time. And then in 1784, he returned to Germany, apparently with the manuscript in his bags. This was a retreat of the Hessians from the Americans, and we don't know if the book was a gift from David Colden, the youngest brother who had all the manuscripts, or it was war booty. In 1801, a front page was added where a German professor, Boldinger, gave it a title, Flora Noviborensis, without an author's name. And I don't know if you can see here, where he says on this, it was the daughter of Cadwallader Colden. That was all the name he gave it. And finally, the manuscript passed to Joseph Banks in London at the British Museum. And so we have Jane Colden's botanic legacy as first woman botanist in America. Her detailed scientific descriptions of the plants were unmatched at that time, and not for a century later. She stands as an equal, in my eyes at least, amid the patriarchy of early describers of American flora. Her plants offer generations of seeds, the connecting dots with us as her legacy. And to complete her legacy, can we possibly name a genus or plant for her? That's me pushing it a little hard, but here, with great thanks to the many people who helped me from start to finish to publish The Path of Jane Colden, a start where I thought, perhaps as a toddler, that daisy chains were the way you wrote a manuscript, and the APS crew had to enlighten me about that one. But to Kimberly and to Peter Doherty, who originally took this on, and to David Carpenter, who answered many, many, many questions. I'm standing high on the rocks above in the Hudson Highlands with my trusty iPhone that took all the photographs, and in the background are the Colden Lands and the Catskill Mountains. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions.
Thank you, Fenella, for a wonderful lecture, and your photographs are just spectacular. A question for you. You mentioned the visit that John made to the Colden family with his son, William. Do we know what relationship Jane and William had, what influence Jane may have had on William's subsequent botanical paintings of his own?
Thank you. These are very good questions. One of the difficulties of this, or the gaps in this material, is I'm working from Dr. Colden's correspondence. It has a lot of gaps in it. And so I chose not to elaborate and stick to very much what was known. And I have to go back try to dig out any details, but very little. And I think it possibly came more from William's words that you probably know better than from Jane's words or Dr. Colden's words. But we do know they visited. And another much younger visitor, also probably the same age as William Barton when he visited, was Samuel Bard, who ended up being a very high-level physician in New York. And what he reported, I think, might relate to how William Bard felt, because Samuel Bard reported years later that he spent a summer with the Coldens when he was in ill health as a teenager, sent there by his father to get some country air. And he spent the summer botanizing with Jane Colden, and she was my instructress, he said, and forever he was grateful to her. And so that particular quote possibly reflects a little bit of what William Bartram might have felt, but I can't make it anything more of that.
Thank you so much for this. It's wonderful. You mentioned briefly of course, the presence and the knowledge of the Native American peoples of the area. Have you come across anything in her work that reflects their direct influence on her personal knowledge?
Only that one picture of the milkweed, the butterfly weed, where she reports, and that actually comes more from a report that somebody else, I think her father, wrote. That's one of the few occasions. But going way back, 1727, Dr. Colden wrote the history of the 5 nations, for the 5 Indian nations in the province of New York. And that still is a book that is available today with a nice introduction. And in the book, my book, I've got the title page of that one because Dr. Colden got to know the Five Nations because he was sent as a representative of the province of New York to a conference of these Five Nations, upstate New York, and apparently managed to become quite friendly with the tribes. And that was part of his reluctance about moving back years later when the French and Indian Wars got a little close. He felt he was in good terms with the Indians. And it took a lot of persuasion to say, well, things have changed and perhaps you should move. But I don't have Jane's words. Again, the same thing. But yes, there were connections and one can imagine a lot.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about her death. Because she was relatively young, but also not just her death, but her personal life. Ideas of marriage, children, things like that.
Thank you, Patrick. You can read the book. No, that's there's again scant information about that. The family was always very respectful that she had her botanizing to do, and her sisters in one letter teased her about not joining in a family picnic where she had a chance to meet a potential suitor, and she missed an opportunity. But I think, in fact, she probably ended up with a Scottish physician who was probably a little like her father, who was not very knowledgeable. He was head of the St. Andrews Society in New York and knew his botany from his medical school days. He was a widower, and together they had this one child, and she died very soon after. The details of that are not given. So that doesn't really answer it in full. But the family did respect that she had her own way of doing things. And actually one of the other things she wrote that reflects a little on this was a 6-page memorandum of cheese making, of how she followed her mother's and her sister's recipes for making cheese. And the very end of it, of all the cheese that she made in 1756 and sold over 300 pounds of cheese in the then town of New York. And so she was very involved in the farm and the farm work, but she also had her own life with a botany that was respected by the family. So it was an interesting dynamic at that time. Her two elder sisters, her eldest sister, Elizabeth, married the son of a fairly high up New York family, and her younger sister, Alice, also married fairly young. And so that was the pattern in those days, but her parents did not apparently push her into it.
And I think that's a great place to leave off. So please join me in thanking Fenella one more time.